The blood dripping from Violet's fingertips onto the cream-colored linen startled her less than it should have. But after 16 hours of sewing wedding dresses for the wealthy women of Randsburg, California, pain had become something she simply endured rather than acknowledged. She wiped the crimson drops away with a rag kept specifically for this purpose. Her 20th year of life feeling more like her 40th as she squinted in the dim lamplight of her small room above the general store, pushing the needle through fabric once more, despite the trembling weakness in her hands. The desert town of Randsburg had sprung up almost overnight in 1895, when gold was discovered in the nearby mountains, and now in the summer of 1897, it bustled with miners, merchants, and hopeful prospectors who believed fortune waited just beneath the next rock. Violet Sutton had arrived 6 months ago with her Aunt Margaret, fleeing the gray dreariness of San Francisco after her parents succumbed to influenza within days of each other. Her aunt ran a modest boarding house on the edge of town, but the income barely covered their expenses, so Violet had taken up sewing to contribute what she could. She had always been skilled with a needle, her mother having taught her from the age of 7. But necessity had transformed her gift into a grinding obligation. The wealthy mine owner's daughter wanted her wedding dress completed in 3 days, an impossible deadline that Violet had foolishly accepted because the payment would cover 2 months of expenses. Now she sat hunched over the intricate beadwork, her spine aching, her eyes burning, her fingers raw and bleeding from the constant prick of the needle and the rough drag of thread through her damaged skin. The knock at her door came just past midnight, startling her so badly she nearly upset the oil lamp. Heart-hammering, she called out, "Who is it?" "Delivery for Miss Sutton," came a man's rough voice, unfamiliar and deep. Violet set aside her sewing with careful precision and moved to the door, opening it only a crack. The hallway was dark, but she could make out the silhouette of a massive man, tall enough that he had to duck his head slightly beneath the doorframe. He held something in his hands, a package wrapped in brown paper. "I did not order anything," she said cautiously. "I know." The man's voice carried a gentleness that contrasted with his imposing size. "But I saw you through the window when I was passing by earlier. Saw your hands bleeding. Figured you could use these." He extended the package toward her, and Violet found herself taking it despite her better judgment. The man stepped back immediately, as though to reassure her he meant no threat. As he moved into the shaft of moonlight coming through the hallway window, Violet got her first clear look at him. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, tied back loosely with a leather cord, and his face was all hard angles and weathered tan skin that spoke of years spent under an unforgiving sun. His shoulders were impossibly broad beneath a worn leather vest, and his arms were thick with muscle that flexed even with the slightest movement. He looked like something carved from the mountains themselves, all raw power and untamed strength. Yet his dark eyes held a surprising warmth as they met hers. "Name's Ryker Young," he said. "I live up in the mountains. Come down for supplies once a month or so. Saw you working through that window, saw the blood on that white fabric. Figured nobody should have to work themselves to pieces like that." Violet looked down at the package in her hands, then back up at this strange mountain man who had appeared at her door past midnight with unexpected kindness. "I do not understand. You bought something for me? A stranger?" "Gloves," Ryker said simply. "Good leather ones, lined with soft fabric. Should protect your hands while you work. And I am telling you right now, you need to rest them. Let them heal before you pick up another needle." "I cannot," Violet said automatically. "I have a deadline. The wedding dress must be finished in 3 days." Ryker's jaw tightened, and she saw something flash in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. What kind of person gives another human being a deadline that makes them bleed? A wealthy one who pays well, Violet replied with a bitter edge she had not intended to reveal. I need the money. My aunt and I, we are barely surviving here. The mountain man studied her for a long moment, and Violet felt exposed under his gaze, as though he could see through the exhaustion and desperation she tried so hard to hide. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. The clink of coins was unmistakable. No, Violet said immediately. I cannot accept charity. It is not charity, Ryker said. Consider it payment for future work. My cabin needs curtains, some mending done on clothes and linens. Nothing urgent. You can do it when your hands heal, when you have time. But right now, you take this money, and you rest those fingers. Violet stared at the pouch he held out, her pride warring with her practical need. The amount in that bag, based on the weight and sound, was likely more than she would make on the wedding dress. It would give her breathing room, time to heal, time to work at a reasonable pace instead of this desperate race against impossible deadlines. Why? She whispered. Why would you help me? Ryker's expression softened, and he stepped forward just enough to press the pouch into her free hand. His fingers brushed hers, calloused and warm, careful not to touch the wounds he had seen. Because I know what it is like to suffer alone and unnoticed. Because kindness is free to give and priceless to receive. Because you deserve better than bleeding for someone else's happiness. Before Violet could respond, he turned and walked down the hallway, his heavy boots making surprisingly little sound on the wooden floor. She watched him disappear down the stairs, then looked at the items in her hands, the package and the pouch of coins, and felt something crack open in her chest. Some wall she had built around her heart since her parents died. She went back into her room and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside were the most beautiful gloves she had ever seen. Butter-soft leather on the outside, with a lining of gentle cotton fabric that would protect her ravaged fingertips. They must have cost a significant sum, more than most people in Randsburg would spend on something purely practical. She slipped them on, and they fit perfectly, as though made specifically for her hands. That night, for the first time in weeks, Violet set aside her sewing and went to bed at a reasonable hour. She told herself it was just practical, that she needed to rest to work efficiently. But deep down, she knew the truth. The mountain man's unexpected kindness had reminded her that she was human, not merely a sewing machine, and that her well-being mattered. The next morning, Violet woke with the sun for the first time in months, rather than having worked through the night. Her hands still ached, but the gloves had allowed them to rest properly, and the worst of the bleeding had stopped. She dressed carefully, putting on her best day dress, a modest blue calico that she had sewn herself, and braided her honey-colored hair back from her face. She went downstairs to find her Aunt Margaret in the boarding house kitchen, preparing breakfast for their handful of residents. Margaret was a stout woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression that had only deepened since taking in her orphaned niece. You look better, Margaret said immediately. Did you finish the dress? No, Violet admitted, but I received an advance payment for another job, enough that I can afford to work at a reasonable pace on the wedding dress and still make our expenses this month. She did not mention the mountain man or his unexpected generosity. Something about the encounter felt private, precious in a way she could not quite articulate. Instead, she helped her aunt prepare breakfast and served the boarders with a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. After breakfast, Violet made her way to the general store where she purchased fabric and thread for her regular work. The proprietor, a gossipy woman named Mrs. Henderson, leaned over the counter with an eager expression. "Saw Ryker Young in here yesterday," she said in a stage whisper. "First time he has come down from those mountains in near 2 months. Bought the strangest things too, not his usual supplies. Got himself a pair of ladies' gloves, expensive ones. Got folks talking, wondering if he is courting someone." Violet felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps he has a sister." "No family at all, far as anyone knows," Mrs. Henderson continued, clearly enjoying her role as town informant. "Been living up in those mountains for 3 years now, ever since he appeared out of nowhere. Does some trapping, some prospecting, keeps to himself mostly. Strong as an ox, though, saw him lift a barrel of flour like it weighed nothing. Most of the unmarried ladies in town have tried to catch his eye at one point or another. But he is not interested. Polite enough, but distant. Makes you wonder what he is running from." "Perhaps he simply prefers solitude," Violet suggested, gathering her purchases. "Or perhaps he is finally ready for company," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing look. "You are a pretty girl, Miss Sutton, and still young. At 20 you should be thinking about finding a husband, not working your fingers to the bone." Violet managed a polite smile and escaped the store before Mrs. Henderson could continue her unsolicited life advice. The truth was, marriage had seemed like an impossible dream ever since her parents died. What man would want a wife with no dowry, no family connections, nothing to offer but her skill with a needle and a mountain of grief? Yet as she walked back to her room, she found herself thinking about Ryker Young's dark eyes and gentle voice, the way he had noticed her suffering when she thought herself invisible, the way he had helped without asking for anything in return. It had been a simple act of kindness, nothing more. But it had touched something deep within her that she had thought long dead. She worked on the wedding dress that day, but at a measured pace, wearing the gloves when her fingers grew too tender. The leather protected her healing skin while still allowing enough dexterity to manage the delicate beadwork. By evening, she had made as much progress as she typically would have in a sleepless night. And she felt human, rather than haggard. 3 days later, she delivered the completed wedding dress to the mine owner's mansion on the hill. The bride to be examined every inch with a critical eye before finally nodding her approval and handing over the payment. Violet walked back to town with the coins in her pocket, feeling both accomplished and empty. The dress was beautiful, perhaps the finest work she had ever done. But the client had not thanked her, had not acknowledged the blood and sleepless nights that had gone into creating her dream gown. As Violet crossed the main street, lost in thought, she nearly collided with a solid wall of muscle and leather. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and she looked up into Ryker Young's surprised face. "Miss Sutton," he said, releasing her immediately. "My apologies. I was not watching where I was going." "No, it was my fault," Violet said quickly. "I was distracted." They stood there in the middle of the dusty street, and Violet became aware of curious eyes watching from nearby windows and doorways. The town gossips would have a field day with this encounter. Ryker seemed to realize it too, because he glanced around with a slight frown. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked. "Away from prying eyes? I have something I would like to discuss with you." Violet knew she should refuse, knew that being seen alone with a man would damage her reputation. But something in his expression made her nod. They walked together out of town, toward the foothills where the desert scrub gave way to rocky terrain. The afternoon sun was brutal, and Violet was grateful for the bonnet that shaded her face. "I wanted to check on your hands," Ryker said once they were out of earshot of the town. Are the gloves helping? Very much so, Violet said, holding up her hands so he could see. The bleeding has stopped, and the worst of the damage is healing. I cannot thank you enough for your kindness. You can thank me by taking better care of yourself, Ryker said firmly. I heard in town that you still finished that wedding dress in 3 days. Heard that you worked day and night to complete it. I worked reasonable hours, Violet protested. The gloves made it possible to work without injury, and I needed to meet the deadline. Ryker stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. Violet, may I call you Violet? She nodded, her heart beating faster at the sound of her name in his deep voice. Violet, you do not owe those wealthy people your health. You do not owe them your blood. I know you need the money, I understand that. But there has to be a better way. If there is, I have not found it, Violet said. And to her horror, she felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. I am sorry. I do not know why I am becoming emotional. You have been nothing but kind to me. Because you are exhausted, Ryker said gently. Because you are carrying too much weight on your shoulders. Because you are allowed to feel what you feel. A tear escaped despite her best efforts, rolling down her cheek. Ryker reached out and wiped it away with his thumb, the gesture so tender that it broke something loose inside her. Suddenly she was crying in earnest, all the grief and exhaustion and loneliness of the past months pouring out of her in wrenching sobs. Ryker pulled her against his broad chest, his strong arms wrapping around her with surprising gentleness. He did not shush her or tell her to stop crying. He simply held her while she fell apart, one hand stroking her back in a soothing rhythm, his presence solid and unwavering. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Violet found herself mortified. She pulled back, wiping at her face with her hands. I am so sorry. I did not mean to fall apart like that. You must think me hysterical. I think you are grieving and exhausted and in need of support, Ryker said. And I think you have been holding everything in for far too long. There is no shame in tears, Violet. Your pain is real and valid. She looked up at him, this mountain man who seemed to understand her better after 2 brief encounters than most people who had known her for years. Why do you care? She asked softly. You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Ryker was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. 3 years ago, I lost my family. A fire took my parents and my younger brother while I was away working a lumber camp. I came home to ashes and death, and I nearly did not survive the grief. I wandered for months, working myself to exhaustion, trying to outrun the pain. Until one day, a stranger showed me kindness, fed me when I had not eaten in days, gave me a place to sleep, reminded me that I was still human and still deserving of care. That kindness saved my life. I am so sorry, Violet whispered, her heart aching for his loss. The point is, I know what it is like to drown in grief and obligation. And when I saw you through that window, bleeding and alone, working yourself to pieces, I saw myself 3 years ago. I could not walk away without trying to help. You did help, Violet said, more than you know. They stood together in the desert heat, the mountains rising behind them, and Violet felt something shift between them, some connection forming that went beyond simple kindness. Ryker Young had seen her at her lowest and had not turned away. He had offered help without judgment, comfort without conditions. And she found herself drawn to him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. I should get back, she said reluctantly. My aunt will worry. May I walk you back? Violet nodded, and they made their way toward town. As they walked, they talked, sharing pieces of their stories. Violet told him about her parents, about the gray winter in San Francisco when the influenza had swept through, about the helpless rage of watching them slip away. Ryker told her about his family's small farm in Oregon, about his brother who had wanted to be a teacher, about the guilt that still haunted him for being away when they needed him most. By the time they reached the edge of town, Violet felt as though she had known Ryker for years rather than days. There was an ease between them, a natural comfort that she had never experienced with anyone else. At the boarding house door, Ryker paused. "I will be in town for a few more days, taking care of supplies and such. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? Nothing fancy, just a meal at the hotel restaurant. I would like to continue our conversation." Violet knew she should refuse. Accepting would fuel the town gossip and potentially damage her reputation. But when she looked into Ryker's earnest face, saw the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, she could not bring herself to say no. "I would like that," she said softly. The smile that spread across Ryker's face transformed him, softening the hard edges and revealing a warmth that made Violet's heart skip. 6 o'clock then. I will come fetch you." That night, Violet lay in bed wearing the gloves Ryker had given her, her hands resting comfortably on her chest. She thought about his story, his loss, the parallel paths of their grief. She thought about the way he had held her while she cried, strong and gentle all at once. And she thought about tomorrow's dinner, about the possibility of something new and hopeful growing in the harsh desert soil of Randsburg. Sleep came easily for the first time in months, and her dreams were full of dark eyes and mountain winds. The next day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Violet found herself unable to focus on her sewing, her thoughts constantly drifting to the evening ahead. Aunt Margaret noticed her distraction and finally cornered her in the kitchen that afternoon. "All right, child, what has gotten into you? You have been floating around here like a ghost all day." Violet took a breath and decided honesty was the best approach. "I have been invited to dinner by a man. His name is Ryker Young." Margaret's eyes widened. "The mountain man? The one all the ladies gossip about?" "He is kind," Violet said firmly. "He helped me when I was struggling, asked nothing in return. I want to know him better." Her aunt studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are 20 years old, Violet. Old enough to make your own choices. And Lord knows you deserve some happiness. Just be careful. Men who live alone in the mountains often have reasons for their solitude." "He told me his reasons," Violet said. "He lost his family, like I did." Understanding softened Margaret's face. "Ah, well then, wear your green dress. It brings out your eyes." At exactly 6 o'clock, Ryker knocked on the door. He had clearly made an effort, his hair neatly tied back, his clothes clean though still rugged. He offered Violet his arm, and they walked together to the small hotel that served the town's most respectable meals. The hotel restaurant was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps casting warm light. Several heads turned as they entered, and Violet heard the immediate whisper of speculation. Ryker seemed oblivious to it all, focused entirely on ensuring Violet was comfortable as he pulled out her chair. They ordered simple fare, roasted chicken and vegetables, and talked while they waited for the food. The conversation flowed easily, moving from childhood memories to dreams for the future. Violet learned that Ryker had taught himself to read, using his mother's Bible and whatever books he could trade for. He learned that Violet had once wanted to design dresses for theater productions, but had given up that dream when her parents died. "Why give it up?" Ryker asked. "You are clearly talented. Theater work requires connections, money for training, the ability to take risks, Violet said. I have none of those things. I am a practical seamstress now, nothing more. You are more than your occupation, Ryker said firmly. Your circumstances right now do not define your entire future. Dreams do not have expiration dates, Violet. His words settled into her chest, warm and hopeful. When had anyone last encouraged her to dream? Her aunt loved her, but Margaret was a practical woman focused on survival, not aspirations. Yet here was this mountain man, this virtual stranger, telling her that her abandoned dreams still mattered. The food arrived, and they ate while continuing to talk. Violet learned that Ryker trapped and hunted for his living, selling furs and meat to traders who passed through the mountains. He did some prospecting as well, though he had never struck it rich like the men who had founded Randsburg. He lived in a cabin he had built himself, deep in the mountains where the air was cool even in summer, and the stars shone brighter than seemed possible. It sounds lonely, Violet said softly. It is, Ryker admitted. But after I lost my family, I could not bear to be around people. Everyone meant well, but their pity felt like knives. In the mountains, I could grieve in peace. I could rebuild myself without an audience. And have you? Rebuilt yourself? Ryker considered the question seriously. I think I have healed enough to rejoin the world, to want connection again, to believe I deserve happiness despite what I've lost. His eyes met hers across the table, and Violet felt the weight of unspoken meaning in his words. Was he saying that she was part of his return to the world? That meeting her had sparked something in him? After dinner, they walked slowly back to the boarding house. The desert night was beautiful, the sky scattered with countless stars, the air finally cooling from the brutal day heat. They talked about everything and nothing, their words weaving a connection that grew stronger with each passing moment. At the boarding house door, Ryker took both of Violet's hands in his, careful of her still healing fingers. I need to head back to my cabin tomorrow, he said. But I will return in 2 weeks with the items I mentioned, the curtains and mending. Would you be willing to see me again when I come back? Yes, Violet said without hesitation. I would like that very much. Ryker lifted one of her hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so courtly and tender that Violet felt her breath catch. Until then, please take care of yourself. Rest your hands. Remember that you matter, not just for what you can produce, but for who you are. He released her hands and stepped back, and Violet felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. She watched him walk away into the night, his broad shoulders and confident stride making him seem like something out of a legend. And she wondered how this mountain man had walked into her life and changed everything in just a handful of days. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Violet's life. She threw herself into her work, but followed Ryker's advice, setting reasonable hours and refusing to take on deadlines that would require her to damage her health. Several potential clients balked at her terms and took their business elsewhere. But Violet found she did not care. The money from Ryker's advance payment, combined with the steadier pace of work, was enough to cover expenses. Her hands healed completely, the raw wounds closing into faint pink scars that would eventually fade. She wore the gloves while working, both for protection and because they reminded her of Ryker's kindness. At night, she would lie in bed and replay their conversations, remembering the way he looked at her as though she mattered, as though she were someone worth knowing. Aunt Margaret noticed the change in her and said nothing. But Violet often caught her aunt watching her with a small, knowing smile. The town gossips had plenty to say, of course, speculation running rampant about the mountain man and the seamstress. Violet ignored them all, focused on counting down the days until Ryker's return. When he finally appeared on a bright afternoon 15 days after his departure, Violet was sitting on the boarding house porch repairing a torn shirt. She looked up and saw him striding down the street, and her heart leaped in her chest. He carried a large canvas pack on his back and led a sturdy mule loaded with supplies. But he dropped everything the moment he saw her, a wide smile breaking across his weathered face. Violet set aside her sewing and stood. And then Ryker was there, reaching for her hands, examining them with careful attention. "They look much better," he said with satisfaction. "No new damage?" "None," Violet assured him. "I have been following your instructions. Reasonable hours, proper rest, no impossible deadlines." "Good," Ryker said, and the pride in his voice warmed her through. "That is very good." They stood there on the porch, grinning at each other like fools, until Aunt Margaret appeared in the doorway with an amused expression. "Mr. Young, would you like to come in for some lemonade? I imagine you are thirsty after your journey." "That would be wonderful, thank you, madam," Ryker said politely. They spent the afternoon on the porch, drinking lemonade and talking. Ryker told them stories about his time in the mountains, about the animals he had seen, and the beauty of the high country. Violet told him about her recent work, about how she had turned away several clients who wanted unreasonable terms, and how liberating it had felt to prioritize her well-being. As evening approached, Ryker pulled several items from his pack. "This is what I need mended," he said, showing Violet a collection of shirts and trousers with various tiers and worn patches. "And I would like curtains for my cabin windows. 4 windows, each about this size." He demonstrated with his hands. "Something sturdy that will block the cold in winter. I brought fabric, but if it is not suitable, I can get something else." The fabric he produced was a thick, serviceable wool in a deep forest green. It was perfect for mountain cabin curtains, and Violet told him so. They discussed the details of the work, and Violet quoted him a fair price, which Ryker accepted without haggling. "How long will it take?" he asked. 2 weeks for everything, working at a proper pace?" Violet said. "Then I will return in 2 weeks," Ryker said. He paused, then added, "Would you be willing to see me before then? I'm staying in town for a few days. Maybe we could take another walk or have dinner again." "I would like that," Violet said, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Over the next 3 days, Violet and Ryker spent every spare moment together. They took long walks in the desert, talking about everything from philosophy to practical matters. They shared meals, both in restaurants and in picnics Violet prepared. They sat together in companionable silence, while Violet sewed and Ryker carved small figures from scraps of wood, a hobby he had taken up in the mountains. The more time Violet spent with Ryker, the more she came to admire him. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He was unfailingly kind to everyone he encountered, from children to the elderly, treating all with equal respect. And he was attentive to her in a way that made her feel cherished, remembering small details she mentioned and following up on them later. But what struck Violet most was how safe she felt with him. Despite his size and obvious strength, despite the fact that he could easily overpower her or anyone else, Ryker was gentle. He never crowded her, never pushed for more than she wanted to give, never made her feel pressured or uncomfortable. He respected her boundaries without her having to state them explicitly, reading her signals and responding accordingly. On his last evening in town before returning to the mountains, they sat together on a ridge overlooking Randsburg, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Ryker had been quiet for a while, and Violet could sense him gathering his thoughts. "Violet," he said finally, his deep voice serious, "I need to be honest with you about something." Violet's heart clenched. Was he about to tell her he was married? That he was leaving and not coming back? That this had all been some elaborate game? "I did not come down from the mountains 2 weeks ago just for supplies," Ryker continued. "I came because I had been feeling lonely, feeling ready to rejoin the world like I told you. But I did not expect to meet you. I did not expect to look through a window and see someone who touched my heart instantly. And I certainly did not expect to fall in love." Violet's breath caught, her eyes wide as she stared at him. Ryker turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "I know it has only been a few weeks. I know this is fast, maybe too fast. But I cannot leave without telling you the truth. I am falling in love with you, Violet Sutton. I love your strength and your kindness. I love how talented you are, how hard you work. I love your laugh and your thoughtfulness and the way you see beauty in the world despite everything you have suffered. I love you, and I needed you to know." Tears were streaming down Violet's face, but this time they were tears of joy rather than grief. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way after losing my parents, after months of just surviving. But you walked into my life and reminded me that I am alive, that I am allowed to be happy. I love you, Ryker Young." Ryker's face transformed with joy, and he cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Violet breathed. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. And then his lips met hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. Violet felt it all the way to her toes, warmth flooding through her body, her heart expanding with emotions so intense they were almost painful. She kissed him back, her hands gripping his vest, anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Ryker rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Come up to the mountains. Just for a visit. Just to see my cabin. I want you to see the place I call home. I want you to understand my world." "When?" Violet asked. "When I come back in 2 weeks. We could spend a few days there, properly chaperoned, of course. You could bring your aunt if that would make you more comfortable. I just want you to see it, to see if you could imagine a future there. Because I am hoping, I am dreaming, that maybe someday you might want to share that life with me." Violet's heart soared. "I would love to see your cabin. And Ryker, I can already imagine a future there with you. I know it is fast, but sometimes you just know. And I know that I love you." They kissed again, longer this time, the sunset painting the sky behind them in brilliant colors. When they finally made their way back to town in the darkness, walking hand in hand, Violet felt as though she were floating. Everything had changed so quickly, but it felt right in a way she could not explain. This mountain man with his gentle heart and strong hands had become essential to her happiness in the space of a few short weeks. The next morning, Ryker left for the mountains with promises to return in 2 weeks. Violet threw herself into the work he had commissioned, pouring all her skill and care into every stitch. She made him 4 beautiful curtains that would keep out the mountain cold, hemmed and sturdy and precisely fitted. She mended his clothes with tiny, invisible stitches that would last for years. And as she worked, she allowed herself to dream about a future in the mountains, about waking up beside Ryker every morning, about building a life together. Aunt Margaret noticed the change in her immediately. "You are in love," she said. Not quite a question. "I am," Violet admitted. "I know it is fast. I know it seems crazy. But Aunt Margaret, I have never felt this way. Never felt so seen, so cherished, so completely myself with another person." Her aunt smiled, a little sad but mostly happy. "Your mother fell in love with your father after knowing him for 3 weeks. Married him a month later. They had 25 good years together before the influenza took them. Sometimes when you know, you know. And I can see that Ryker Young is a good man. A bit rough around the edges maybe, but good where it counts. He wants me to visit his cabin," Violet said. "Wants me to see his home, to see if I could imagine a life there. He mentioned you coming as well, for propriety." "A mountain cabin," Margaret mused. "Well, I suppose it could not be worse than this dusty desert town. At least the mountains have trees. Yes, I will come. I would like to see where my niece might end up living." The 2 weeks passed in a mixture of eager anticipation and nervous energy. Violet completed all of Ryker's commissions and took on several smaller jobs to keep herself busy. She also began preparing for the mountain visit, mending her warmest clothes and making a few new items suitable for cooler weather. When Ryker finally returned, he brought gifts. For Aunt Margaret, a beautiful knitted shawl he had traded for from a woman who lived near his cabin. For Violet, a carved wooden box with a hinged lid, the exterior decorated with intricate patterns of mountains and pine trees. "I made it for you," he said shyly, pressing it into her hands. "I thought you could keep your sewing supplies in it, or whatever else you like." Violet traced the carvings with wondering fingers. "Ryker, this is beautiful. You made this yourself?" "Carving helps me think," he said. "I have been thinking about you constantly for 2 weeks, so I had plenty of time to work." She kissed him right there in front of her aunt and anyone else who might be watching, too full of joy to care about propriety. Ryker laughed against her lips and pulled her close, lifting her slightly off the ground with the strength of his embrace. They left for the mountains the next morning, Aunt Margaret riding Ryker's mule while Ryker and Violet walked alongside. The journey took most of the day, climbing from the desert heat into the cooler air of the foothills and then higher into the mountains proper. The landscape transformed around them, scrub giving way to scattered pines and then to thick forest. Violet breathed deeply of the cool, clean air, feeling tension she had not known she carried begin to ease from her shoulders. "It is beautiful," she said to Ryker, who walked beside her with easy confidence, clearly at home in this environment. "Wait until you see the view from the cabin," he promised. As afternoon began shading toward evening, they emerged into a clearing on a mountain slope. Ryker's cabin sat at the clearing's edge, backed by towering pines. It was small, but solidly built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport up the mountain. A small creek bubbled nearby, and the view stretched for miles, showing layer after layer of mountains fading into blue distance. "Oh," Violet breathed, stopping in her tracks. "Oh, Ryker, it is perfect." Pride shone in his face as he watched her take it all in. "Come on, let me show you inside." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a large stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A loft above held Ryker's bed, accessible by a sturdy ladder. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted, and everything was surprisingly clean and organized. "I built a small guest cabin about 50 yards that way," Ryker said, pointing. Figured I might need it someday if anyone came to visit. It is just one room with a bed and a stove, but it is sturdy and weather-tight. You and your aunt can stay there, be comfortable and proper. They spent the next 3 days in the mountains, and it was the happiest time Violet could remember, since before her parents died. Ryker took them on walks through the forest, showing them the places he hunted and trapped, the hidden meadows where wildflowers grew, the rocky overlooks with breathtaking views. He taught Violet to fish in the creek, standing behind her with his arms around her, guiding her hands on the pole, his warm breath on her neck, making her shiver with something that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Violet sewed and Ryker carved and Aunt Margaret knitted, the three of them comfortable in companionable silence or easy conversation. Margaret and Ryker got along well, her aunt clearly approving of the mountain man who had stolen Violet's heart. On their last night, after Margaret had retired to the guest cabin, Ryker and Violet sat alone by the dying fire. He had been quiet all evening, and Violet could sense something building in him. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Ryker turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I am thinking that I do not want you to leave. I am thinking that these 3 days have been the happiest I have had in 3 years. I am thinking that this cabin feels like a home for the first time since I built it, and that is because you are here." Violet's heart was pounding. "Ryker." He slid from his chair to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I know it has only been a month. I know people will say we are crazy, that we are moving too fast. But Violet, I am 30 years old. I have seen enough of life to know what matters. And you matter. You matter more than anything else. Marry me. Come live here with me in these mountains. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are, how loved you are. Let me give you a home where you never have to bleed for someone else's happiness ever again." Tears were streaming down Violet's face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ryker, I will marry you. I love you so much." Ryker surged up and kissed her deeply, and Violet kissed him back with all the love and hope and joy she felt. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing and crying at once, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "I have had this for a week," he admitted. "Bought it before I left town last time. I know I should have waited longer, done this more properly, but I could not help myself. I knew even then that I wanted to marry you." Inside the box was a simple gold ring with a small ruby, the red stone glowing like captured fire. It was not expensive or fancy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Ryker slipped it onto Violet's finger, and it fit perfectly. They told Aunt Margaret the next morning, and she cried happy tears and hugged them both. "Your parents would be so happy," she told Violet. "They always wanted you to find love, to be cherished. I can see that Ryker will take good care of you." They returned to Ransburg to make arrangements. The wedding would be small and simple, held at the little church on the edge of town. Violet spent her days sewing a wedding dress for herself, this time with joy in every stitch rather than exhaustion and pain. It was a simple gown of ivory cotton with delicate embroidery she had designed herself. Nothing fancy but beautiful in its understated elegance. Ryker stayed in town during the preparations, unwilling to be separated from Violet for longer than necessary. He made arrangements to continue his trapping business from the mountains, establishing agreements with traders for regular pickups of furs and meat. He also began building an addition onto the cabin, a proper bedroom on the main floor, and a room where Violet could set up her sewing workspace with good light and space for her materials. The wedding took place on a bright October morning in 1897. exactly 6 weeks after Ryker had first seen Violet through that window with her bleeding fingers. It was a small gathering. Just Aunt Margaret, a few of the boarding house residents who had become friendly with Violet, and the minister. Ryker wore clean trousers and a new shirt Violet had made him, his hair tied back neatly. Violet wore her ivory dress and carried wildflowers Ryker had picked for her from the mountain meadows. As they stood before the minister and spoke their vows, Violet thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. 2 months ago, she had been drowning in grief and exhaustion, working herself to pieces, bleeding for strangers who did not care. Now she stood beside a man who loved her, who had seen her at her lowest and had offered kindness without conditions, who had reminded her that she mattered. She thought about the gloves he had bought her, the first gesture of care in that transformation, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the moment he had looked through her window and decided to help. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ryker kissed her with such tenderness that Violet felt tears prick her eyes. This was real. This was her life now. She was loved, she was cherished, and she was home. They held a small reception in the boarding house dining room, and then Ryker swept Violet up onto his horse, and they rode together into the mountains, leaving the dusty desert town behind. Aunt Margaret stayed in Randsburg to continue running the boarding house, but with promises to visit come spring. The cabin felt different when they arrived that evening, transformed from a bachelor's shelter into their shared home. Ryker had finished the bedroom addition while in town, and it held a new bed frame he had built himself, wide enough for two. He carried Violet over the threshold, his strength making it effortless, and set her down gently in their new bedroom. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," he said softly. "Mrs. Young?" Violet repeated, testing how the name felt. "I like that." That night, Ryker made love to his new wife, with reverence and care, treating her like something precious and beloved. Violet had been nervous, her experience with physical intimacy non-existent, but Ryker was patient and attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. Afterward, she lay in his arms, her head on his broad chest, listening to his heartbeat and feeling utterly content. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Ryker asked, his voice rumbling under her ear. "For seeing me, for helping me, for loving me, for giving me a future I never dared to hope for." Ryker tightened his arms around her. "You never have to thank me for loving you. Loving you is the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done. You are my heart, Violet. You are my home." They fell asleep tangled together, warm and safe and loved, while outside the mountain wind sang through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. Violet learned the rhythms of mountain life, the daily tasks required to survive in such a remote location. She learned to garden in the short growing season, to preserve food for the long winter, to split wood and haul water, and all the practical skills required. Ryker was an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things. She set up her sewing space in the new room Ryker had built, with a large window that let in beautiful, natural light. She took on selective commissions from town, work she could do at her own pace without deadlines or pressure. Ryker would carry finished pieces down the mountain when he went for supplies and bring back new projects and payment. It was enough to give Violet purpose and income without overwhelming her. But more than that, she was simply happy. Happy in a deep, fundamental way she had never experienced before. waking up beside Ryker every morning, sharing meals together, spending evenings by the fire, walking through the mountains hand in hand. All of it filled her with joy. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They made love with increasing confidence and passion, learning each other's bodies and preferences. They built a life together. Two broken people who had found each other and become whole. Winter came to the mountains in November, bringing heavy snows that isolated them completely for weeks at a time. Violet discovered she loved the snow, loved being snowed in with Ryker in their cozy cabin. They spent the long winter evenings reading aloud to each other from Ryker's collection of books, playing chess and cards, making love and talking and simply being together. It was during that first winter that Violet realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses for 2 months, and her breasts were tender. Her appetite changed. She waited until she was certain before telling Ryker, wanting to be sure. She told him on Christmas evening, after they had shared a simple meal and exchanged small gifts. Ryker had carved her an intricate jewelry box, while she had sewn him a warm winter coat lined with fur he had prepared himself. As they sat by the fire, Violet took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a baby growing here," she said softly. "Our baby. You are going to be a father, Ryker." The expression on his face was something Violet would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, joy, wonder, and love all mixed together, his eyes filling with tears. "Truly?" he whispered. "Truly," Violet confirmed. Ryker dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her stomach, his strong shoulders shaking with emotion. Violet ran her fingers through his long hair, her own tears falling freely. After all the loss they had both endured, this new life felt like a miracle, like proof that hope and joy could bloom even in the aftermath of grief. "I am going to love this child so much," Ryker said, his voice muffled against her dress. "I am going to be the best father I can be." "I know you will," Violet said. "You are already the best husband." The months of pregnancy were both challenging and beautiful. Morning sickness plagued Violet for weeks, and Ryker took over most of the household chores, bringing her water and crackers, holding her hair when she was sick, never complaining. As she grew bigger, he became even more protective, insisting she rest frequently, not allowing her to do any heavy work. Spring came early to the mountains that year, the snow melting in March to reveal new growth and returning wildlife. Aunt Margaret made the journey up in April, having hired someone to manage the boarding house in her absence, determined to be present for the birth of her great-niece or nephew. She arrived with supplies and news from town, hugging Violet carefully around her large belly. "You are glowing," Margaret said with a smile. "Pregnancy agrees with you." "Happiness agrees with me," Violet corrected. "And Ryker takes such good care of me." "That man adores you," Margaret observed. "Follows you with his eyes constantly, like he cannot believe his good fortune." The baby came on a warm May morning, after a labor that lasted through the night. Ryker stayed by Violet's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, supporting her through each contraction. Aunt Margaret served as midwife, having delivered many babies in her younger years. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, Margaret cleaned him off and placed him in Violet's arms. "A boy," she announced. "A healthy, strong boy." Violet looked down at her son, at his wrinkled red face and shock of dark hair, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. Ryker leaned over them both, his large hand gently touching the baby's tiny head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Ryker whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Violet. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas, after Ryker's brother who had died in the fire. Thomas Young, born in a mountain cabin, surrounded by love and hope and new beginnings. Aunt Margaret stayed for 2 months, helping with the baby in the household while Violet recovered from childbirth. It was a precious time, 3 generations living together in the small cabin, watching Thomas grow and change daily. When Margaret finally returned to Randsburg in July, it was with promises to visit again soon and invitations for them to come down the mountain whenever they could. Violet settled into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he thrived on his mother's milk and the clear mountain air. Ryker was an attentive father, often walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed, singing to him in his deep voice, showing him the mountains and forest even though Thomas was far too young to understand. "I want him to grow up knowing he is loved," Ryker told Violet one evening as they watched their son sleep in the wooden cradle Ryker had built. "I want him to always feel safe and cherished. I want him to have the childhood I had before the fire, full of warmth and family." "He will," Violet assured him. "We will give him all of that and more." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to little boy, full of energy and curiosity, exploring the mountains with the fearlessness of a child who knows he is protected. Violet continued her sewing work, now with Thomas playing at her feet or napping nearby. Ryker continued his trapping and hunting, providing for his family while also being present and involved in their daily life. When Thomas was 3, Violet became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, her body knowing what to do. And in the spring of 1901, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rose, and she had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's dark eyes. With 2 children, the cabin began to feel crowded, so Ryker built an addition, expanding their home to include 2 small bedrooms for the children and a larger main room. It took him months of hard work, but he completed it before Rose's first birthday, and the expanded cabin felt like a proper family home. Life in the mountains was not always easy. There were harsh winters that tested their resolve, summers when water ran low, times when game was scarce, and they had to carefully ration supplies. But through it all, they had each other. They had love and commitment and partnership. When challenges arose, they faced them together, supporting each other through difficulty and celebrating each success. Thomas started learning to read and write at 5, with Violet serving as his teacher using the books they had accumulated. He was a bright child, quick to learn and endlessly curious about the world. Rose was more reserved but equally intelligent, watching everything with careful attention before attempting things herself. Aunt Margaret visited regularly, making the journey up the mountain each spring and fall. She had closed the boarding house when she turned 60, deciding she would rather spend her remaining years near family. Ryker and Violet built her a small cabin near their own, and Margaret settled into mountain life with surprising ease, becoming an essential part of their household and a beloved grandmother figure to the children. When Thomas was 7 and Rose was 4, Violet found herself pregnant once more. This pregnancy was unexpected and challenging, her body older now and the work of caring for 2 active children making rest difficult. Ryker hired a young woman from town to come help during the day, over Violet's protests. "You worked yourself bloody once before," he reminded her gently. "I will not watch you do it again. Accept the help, Violet. Let yourself be cared for." So Violet accepted the help, and in the winter of 1902, she gave birth to another son, a baby with her light hair and a temperament as calm as a still pond. They named him James, and he completed their family in a way none of them had quite realized was missing. 3 children kept them busy, their days full of noise and activity and endless needs. But it was a good kind of busy, the kind that came from a home full of love and life. Ryker expanded the cabin once more, adding a loft bedroom for the older children and giving the babies their own room. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Ryker and Violet would sit together on the porch they had built, looking out over the mountains they called home. They would talk about their day, their children, their dreams. And always, Ryker would take Violet's hands in his, checking them over even though he knew they were fine, a habit he had never broken from those early days. "Still no new damage," he would say with satisfaction. "You take such good care of me," Violet would reply, and it was always true. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in October of 1907, they took a rare trip down to Randsburg without the children, leaving them in Aunt Margaret's capable care. They visited the town where they had met, walking past the boarding house where Violet had once bled over her sewing, past the general store where Ryker had bought the gloves that changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Ryker asked as they sat together at the same ridge where he had first confessed his love. Leaving everything, marrying so quickly, committing to a life of such isolation. Violet turned to look at her husband, this mountain man who had saved her in more ways than one. His hair was streaked with silver now at the temples, and lines crinkled around his eyes from years of mountain sun and smiling. But he was still the strongest, most beautiful man she had ever known. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me life, Ryker. Real life, not just survival. You taught me that I matter, that I deserve care and love and happiness. You gave me a home and a family and a future I could never have imagined. How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" "I love you," Ryker said, pulling her close. "Every day, I love you more. Every day I'm grateful that I looked through that window and saw you. Every day I thank God that you gave me a chance, that you trusted me, that you built this life with me." They kissed as the sun set over the desert, just as they had a decade earlier. But this kiss carried the weight and depth of 10 years of partnership, of challenges faced together, of children raised and love deepened. They were no longer 2 broken people finding each other, but 2 whole people who had built something beautiful together. That night, they made love in the hotel room they had rented, with the luxury of privacy and uninterrupted time, rediscovering each other's bodies with the familiar ease of long partnership and the excitement of devoted passion. Afterward, Violet traced the scars on Ryker's chest, souvenirs from his years of hard work, while he ran his fingers through her long hair. "Should we have more children?" Violet asked idly. "Are you saying you want more?" Ryker asked with interest. "Maybe one more," Violet said. "I always imagined having 4. 4 seems like a good, complete number." "Then we will have 4, Ryker said, kissing her forehead. "Whatever you want, my love. I am happy with 3. I would be happy with 4. I would be happy with 10, if that is what you wanted. As long as we are together, I have everything I need." They returned to the mountains the next day, back to their children and their home, and Violet felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was where she belonged. These mountains, this cabin, this man, this family, this life. She did become pregnant again the following spring, and in early 1909, she gave birth to their 4th and final child, another daughter they named Alice. With 4 children, their cabin was full of life and noise and constant activity. Thomas was 11 now, helping his father with outdoor work and beginning to learn the skills he would need to survive in the mountains. Rose was 7, quiet and thoughtful, spending hours with Violet learning to sew and cook. James was 5, adventurous and fearless, constantly getting into mischief that his siblings had to rescue him from. And baby Alice was the darling of the entire family, passed from arm to arm, spoiled by everyone. Aunt Margaret was in her late 60s now, her hair completely white, her movements slower, but her mind as sharp as ever. She helped with the children, told them stories, taught them songs and games she remembered from her own childhood. She often told Violet how proud she was, how well she had built her life, how much her parents would have loved to see her so happy. As the years passed, life on the mountain found its rhythm. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Thomas proved to have his father's love of the wilderness and his mother's artistic eye, beginning to carve figures from wood that rivaled Ryker's skill. Rose discovered a talent for gardening, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the rocky mountain soil with patient determination. James showed signs of wanderlust, constantly asking about the world beyond their mountains, talking about places he wanted to see. And Alice, the baby, was growing into a child of fierce intelligence and stubborn will. Ryker and Violet grew older together, their love deepening rather than fading with time. They had arguments occasionally, as all couples do. But they had learned how to fight fair, how to listen to each other, how to apologize and forgive. They had learned that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, a commitment made fresh each day to put the other person first, to work together, to build something greater than either could achieve alone. On a fall evening in 1915, when Thomas was 18 and preparing to leave for college in San Francisco, the whole family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. It had become a tradition over the years, this evening gathering, a time to be together and appreciate the beauty around them. Thomas sat beside his father, their similar builds and features making their relationship obvious to anyone who looked. Rose sat with baby Alice, now 6 years old, braiding the little girl's hair. James sprawled across the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood. Aunt Margaret rocked in her chair, a blanket across her lap despite the mild temperature. And Violet sat beside Ryker, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "I am going to miss this," Thomas said quietly. "The mountains, the quiet, being all together like this." "We will miss you too," Ryker said. "But education is important. Your mother and I want you to have opportunities, to see the world, to choose your own path. We will be here whenever you want to come home." "Always," Violet added. "This will always be your home, Thomas, no matter where life takes you." "I want to be like you too," Rose said suddenly. "When I grow up, I want to find someone who loves me the way Papa loves Mama. I want to build something real and lasting." Violet felt tears prick her eyes. "You will, sweetheart. And remember, love is not just about feelings. It is about choosing each other every day. It is about kindness and respect and partnership. It is about seeing someone bleed and buying them gloves," Ryker added with a smile, squeezing Violet's shoulder. She laughed and swatted his chest playfully. "You will never let me forget that, will you?" "Never," Ryker said, kissing the top of her head. "That was the moment my life changed. That was the moment I found my purpose, my home, my heart. Why would I ever forget it?" As the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the family sat together in comfortable silence, bound by love and shared history. Violet thought about the young woman she had been 18 years ago, bleeding over her sewing, drowning in grief and exhaustion. unable to imagine a future worth living. She thought about the mountain man who had seen her suffering and offered help without conditions, who had reminded her that she mattered, who had loved her into wholeness. Their story had started with bleeding fingers and a pair of gloves, with an act of simple kindness that had changed two lives forever. But it had grown into so much more, into a love story that spanned nearly 2 decades, into a family built on foundation of mutual respect and devotion, into a life that neither of them could have imagined in those early days. Thomas left for college in San Francisco the following week, and the house felt emptier without him. But he wrote letters regularly and came home for summers, and eventually graduated with honors before returning to the mountains to start his own homestead nearby. He married a kind woman he met at college, and they built a life that echoed his parents', full of love and purpose. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who eventually married a young doctor who came to practice in Randsburg. They lived in town, and Rose used her sewing skills to make clothes for the poor families who could not afford the fancy seamstresses. She visited her parents often, bringing her children to experience the mountain life she had loved so much. James was the adventurer of the family, leaving at 18 to see the world. He sent letters from amazing places, worked on ships and railroads, lived a life of freedom and discovery. But he always came home for holidays, always made time for family. And eventually he settled in a coastal town where he ran a fishing business and raised his children with stories of his mountain childhood. Alice, the baby, grew up to be a teacher, opening a small school in Randsburg where she taught children of all backgrounds with patience and creativity. She never married, declaring that she had too much work to do and too many children who needed her attention. But she was happy and fulfilled, making a difference in her community. Aunt Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1920 at the age of 73. They buried her on the mountain she had come to love, under a towering pine tree. And the whole family mourned the loss of the woman who had been grandmother, helper, friend, and glue that held them together. But even in grief, they celebrated the life she had lived and the love she had given. Ryker and Violet grew old together in their mountain cabin, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw their children build successful lives, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays with a family that had grown large and loving. On a spring morning in 1935, when Ryker was 65 and Violet was 58, they sat together on their porch watching the sunrise. It was a daily ritual now, this quiet time together before the day's demands began. Ryker's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they still held Violet's carefully, still checked them over with the same protective care he had shown since the very beginning. 38 years, Violet marveled. Can you believe it has been 38 years since we married? 38 years since I made the best decision of my life, Ryker corrected. 38 years of waking up beside you. Not nearly long enough. Ryker Young, you old romantic, Violet teased. After all these years, you still make me blush. After all these years, you are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, Ryker replied. Still the love of my life, still my heart and my home. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains they had called home for nearly 4 decades. Violet thought about the life they had built, about the love they had shared, about the family they had raised. She thought about how a simple act of kindness, a pair of gloves, and an instruction to rest, had changed the entire trajectory of her existence. I would do it all again, she said softly. Every moment, every challenge, every joy and sorrow. I would choose this life, choose you, 1,000 times over. As would I, Ryker said, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. You saved me as much as I saved you, Violet. You gave me a reason to live again, to hope again, to believe that happiness was possible after loss. You gave me everything. They sat together as the sun climbed higher. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from broken pieces, who had proved that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Their story had started with bleeding fingers and protective gloves, with a mountain man who saw suffering and chose compassion, with a seamstress who dared to trust and hope again. And it was a story that would continue, passed down through generations of children and grandchildren, a legacy of love and kindness, and the profound truth that sometimes the smallest gestures can change everything. Sometimes, seeing someone's pain and choosing to help, choosing to care, choosing to love without conditions or expectations, can create ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could imagine. In the mountains of California, in a cabin built by hand and filled with decades of memories, Ryker and Violet Young grew old together in love and contentment. They had both known profound loss, had both been broken by life's cruelty, but they had found each other and been made whole. They had built a family, created a legacy, lived a love story that would be remembered and treasured long after they were gone. And it all started with a mountain man who saw her fingers bleeding from sewing, bought her gloves, and told her to rest them now. A simple act of kindness that blossomed into a lifetime of love, proving that compassion and care can heal wounds deeper than any physical injury, and that true love, when nurtured with respect and devotion, can weather any storm and last forever. As afternoon settled over the mountains, their children and grandchildren began arriving for the weekly family dinner that had become tradition. The cabin filled with noise and laughter, and the chaos of multiple generations gathered together. Ryker and Violet moved through the crowd, greeting each person with hugs and kisses, their faces glowing with the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and love well given. This was their legacy. Not wealth or fame or grand accomplishments, but this: a family bound by love, a home filled with joy, a love story that had started with bleeding fingers and grown into something timeless and beautiful. And as Violet stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, wearing the gloves Ryker had bought her all those years ago, carefully preserved and still used when she sewed, she knew that she had found what everyone searches for: a love worth bleeding for, a man worth trusting, a life worth living fully and joyfully until the very end.